Can you imagine bringing a gun to school or walking miles on your own as a little kid? Times have definitely changed. From duck-and-cover drills to one-room classrooms, school life in the 1950s was a whole different world. Let's take a look at some of the most shocking differences. Get ready, because this is going to blow your mind. The 1950s in the United States was a transformative decade, shaped by the post-World War II economic boom, the dawn of the Cold War, and the early rumblings of the civil rights movement. For young people, the world was also evolving in significant ways. By this time, mandatory schooling had become the norm, placing education at the center of childhood and adolescence. This period also saw the rise of a new cultural phenomenon, the teenager, a term that gained popularity as society began to recognize adolescence, the age range of 13 to 19, as a distinct phase of life, complete with its own identity, trends, and challenges. Fast forward 70 years, and the changes are remarkable. From the tools used in classrooms, like chalkboards and ditto machines, to the overall school environment, nearly everything has been transformed. But those are just the start. Schools in the 1950s had many practices and norms that seem unimaginable today. Curious to see how much has changed? Let's take a deep dive into the fascinating and sometimes shocking differences between schools then and now. Before the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990, firearms in schools weren't as restricted as they are today. In fact, during the 1950s, it wasn't unusual for students to bring guns to school for extracurricular activities like shooting clubs or hunting after class. At the time, kids could legally buy firearms through mail-ordered catalogs without background checks or any form of transaction record, things that seem shocking now. It wasn't uncommon to see students store rifles in their lockers or cars, with little concern about safety regulations. Guns were viewed differently, and the cultural attitude towards them in schools was worlds apart from what we know today. In the 1950s, it was common for public schools to incorporate prayer and Bible readings into the daily routine. Around 40% of American schools included some form of religious activity, such as reciting the Christian Lord's Prayer. In certain states, these practices were even mandated by law. However, this all changed with the landmark Engel v. Vitale case in 1962, when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that state-sponsored prayer in public schools violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. This ruling effectively ended the era of school-led religious practices, marking a significant shift towards secularism in the public education system. The 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson ruling allowed racial segregation in public facilities under the doctrine of separate but equal. This applied to schools, where black and white students were educated in separate institutions. In reality, the facilities were far from equal. Schools for black students were often underfunded, overcrowded, and poorly maintained compared to the larger, better-equipped schools attended by white students. This inequity persisted until 1954, when the Brown v. Board of Education decision overturned Plessy v. Ferguson, declaring that segregation in public schools was inherently unequal and unconstitutional. This marked the beginning of the long and difficult road toward desegregation in American schools. In 1950s America, it was commonplace for young children to walk to school by themselves. A 2014 survey revealed that 70% of people who grew up in the 1950s were allowed to walk more than a mile from home by the time they were around 8 years old. At that time, school buses were just starting to be introduced, but transportation options were often limited, especially in rural areas. As a result, many students had to walk considerable distances, and parents were generally more comfortable with children navigating their neighborhoods unaccompanied, a stark contrast to today's more cautious approach to child safety. The one-room schoolhouse was a cornerstone of American education well into the early 1950s, particularly in rural areas, and often for African American students in the segregated Jim Crow South. In these schools, a single teacher was tasked with instructing students of all ages and academic levels in the same room. This meant the teacher had to juggle multiple lessons at once, moving between different groups while the rest of the students worked independently. These small schools fostered a unique sense of community and self-reliance, but they also reflected the vast inequalities in education, especially for minority students in the South. In the 1950s, corporal punishment was a standard disciplinary method in American schools, especially in the South. It ranged from paddling or caning to more unusual punishments like making students stand on one leg. According to a 1954 poll, 55% of Americans supported the use of corporal punishment in schools. At the time, this form of discipline was widely accepted, with teachers often taking the role of enforcers. However, attitudes began to shift in the 1970s, as states gradually banned the practice, driven in part by parents who believed that disciplining children should be their responsibility, not the school's. While still legal in some states today, corporal punishment is much less common and highly controversial. In the 1950s, the looming threat of nuclear war due to Cold War tensions led to the introduction of a duck and cover drills in schools across the U.S. created by the Truman Federal Civil Defense Administration. These drills aimed to teach students how to protect themselves in the event of a nuclear attack. While ducking under desks and covering their heads wouldn't have saved students from a direct nuclear blast, the drills were designed to help reduce injuries from the blinding flash of light or shockwaves that could shatter windows in the blast's vicinity. These drills reflected the pervasive fear of nuclear conflict and became a defining feature of Cold War-era school life. While duck and cover drills faded with the end of the Cold War, a new and grim routine has taken their place: active shooter drills. Today, approximately 95% of public schools in the U.S. conduct these drills in response to the rising number of school shootings. Since the tragic Columbine High School massacre in 1999, there have been over 400 recorded school shootings. These drills are designed to prepare students and staff for the possibility of an active shooter on campus, reflecting the heartbreaking reality of modern-day school safety concerns. In the 1950s, strict dress codes in schools aimed to project an image of dignity and discipline for American youth. Boys were expected to wear neatly pressed slacks paired with button-down shirts, while girls adhered to skirts that fell below the knee and modest, form-fitting tops. Violations of the dress code often resulted in public shaming, with students being reprimanded for nonconformity. This pressure to conform played a role in fueling the youth rebellion that led to the counterculture movement of the 1960s, as students pushed back against rigid societal norms. Boxing was a popular sport in many American schools during the 1950s, much more so than it is today. Schools across the country had boxing teams, and states like Louisiana even had a government-sanctioned school league that culminated in a state championship. The sport was seen as a way to teach discipline, toughness, and sportsmanship. However, concerns about student safety and the risks of head injuries led to its gradual decline in school athletics, leaving boxing a rarity in today's school sports programs. In the 1950s, Catholic schools were highly influential, with nuns and priests serving as teachers and disciplinarians for a significant portion of American students. Catholic education was widespread, educating 80% of all private school children and about 10% of the overall student population. These religious figures were strict, often reinforcing discipline through religious instruction and moral authority, which made for a very different school experience compared to public schools. During the 1950s, concerns about the physical fitness of American youth led to the implementation of military-style fitness programs in schools. There was a belief that overweight or physically unfit young men would be poor soldiers if a Third World War ever broke out. Under federal direction, PE programs prioritized strength and endurance training to prepare students not just for health, but for national defense. In 1960, President John F. Kennedy sounded the alarm over America's increasingly sedentary lifestyle, leading to the introduction of the La Sierra Fitness Program. This rigorous program, known for its high physical standards and military-like structure, was rolled out in schools to ensure that students would grow up fit and capable of meeting national security needs. The program emphasized discipline, teamwork, and athleticism, aiming to build a generation that could rise to the nation's defense. In the 1950s, C was considered the average grade, and most students were content with it. The GPA scale was much stricter back then, with a national average around 2.5. Unlike today, where students often aim for A's and B's, getting a C was normal and didn't carry the same negative connotations. Interestingly, in the 1960s and 70s, grade inflation became common, partly due to professors helping students avoid the Vietnam draft by ensuring they maintained a good academic standing. Back in the 1950s, paying for college was far more affordable. With tuition costs much lower and programs like the GI Bill covering up to $500 per year, students could work summer jobs and easily earn enough to cover their school expenses. Today, skyrocketing tuition fees make the idea of funding a degree through part-time work a distant memory. During the height of the Cold War, fear of communist infiltration even reached American schools. In the 1950s, it wasn't just allowed, but encouraged, to question teachers' political leanings, particularly if they showed any signs of sympathy towards socialism or communism. McCarthyism led to intense scrutiny of educators, who were expected to align with pro-American, anti-communist ideals. Conformity was a central theme in 1950s education, with little flexibility in how students were taught. Individual learning needs were rarely considered, and children with disabilities were often denied access to public schools. Those who did attend faced numerous challenges due to a lack of support. The push for inclusivity wouldn't gain momentum until later, with significant changes starting when President John F. Kennedy signed the Maternal and Child Health and Mental Retardation Planning Bill in 1963, increasing funding for special education programs. Unlike today's focus on college readiness, schools in the 1950s separated students based on perceived academic potential. Career tracking divided children between college preparatory courses for those excelling in subjects like math and science, and vocational training for those seen as less academically inclined. Boys were often funneled into shop classes, while girls were directed toward home economics, reinforcing traditional gender roles in education.